Today we are going to be having a conversation about civics, uh, and something that I call, and well, not just me, but many people have called social libertarianism. Um, to begin, I want to start with kind of addressing one of the biggest misconceptions that people have about modern day politics. Now, often people see things from the lens of left versus right, where the left is considered progressive, the right is considered conservative, right? Now, the thing is that those two terms, in and of itself, do not have concrete objective definitions. Those definitions are very specific to the context that our current society lives within. Now, what that means is that, a conservative, by their very nature, lean towards wanting to conserve the status quo, whereas the progressive wants to initiate progress, initiate change, right? Our left right dynamics has basically become where you fit on that scale, where the ultra right, ultra conservative viewpoint is that things need to remain the way they have been. We shouldn't be moving towards new systems, new structures. The way the country was made to begin with is the correct way. Nothing needs to be changed. We need to go back to the original constitution, et cetera, whatever, right? Whereas, the far progressives say, oh, we need reform. We need to maybe go so far as to have some constitutional amendments. We need to change the way the electoral college is structured. We need to change the way the Senate is structured. Maybe we need to change the Supreme Court. We need to add social programs. We need to do all of these things. In the middle, you basically have both Democrat and Republican neocons. Effectively, it doesn't matter if you're, a liberal neocon might be a little bit more progressive on the societal front, where they try to cater more towards minority groups. They try to cater more towards a more semi-equitable system. I mean, they don't really address class so much as they address race, but they do at least want to make you know what? I wouldn't even say that they want to. They advertise that they would like a more equitable society for minorities, but they don't necessarily address, upper, lower, middle class directly. And, obviously a right-leaning neocon is no different. They just scrap the social part. But ultimately, they are maintaining the status quo. They are maintaining what is currently in power, and they're not on that far left of the progressive element, where you've got people like Bernie Sanders that want to actually do legitimate reform, healthcare, tax code reform, taking higher taxation on the wealthier, lower taxation on the poor, trying to create a more balanced, equitable society. He speaks more to the class. But here's the thing: if we jump across the pond to Europe, even our most left-leaning members of society are still considered fairly right-wing, right? The system that Bernie Sanders wants to put in place is already to the right of Denmark and Norway. One of the beautiful things about being a gamer is I do get to meet people all around the world, and I actually do know several people that live in Denmark, live in Norway. They come from those social democracies. And if you call them far left, which is what our country views them as, they don't see it like that. They're like, no, we're conservative, man. You guys are ultra right. Like, they, the framing is relative to the society that you're coming from, which is a very, very difficult system in which to have civil discourse and debate and honest, substantive discussions on what the meat and potatoes are of what the actual rules should be on how our government and our society should run. It's hard to do, because if right versus left is defined by conservative versus progressive, that is a perpetually moving goalpost. And we see that goalpost constantly. Case in point, the fundamental misunderstanding of that leads to a lot of political arguments and political dissent because different sides define different terms differently. I would restructure it so rather than simply left versus right, we exist on more of a grid system, and it would look something like this. Okay? Rather than focusing on left versus right being maintaining the status quo versus changing things, it should be whether you are community focused or whether you are individual focused. Okay? But there is another measuring stick independent of that, which is how authoritative your society is versus how libertative, I guess that's not really a word, you get it, a society is. Okay? When you reframe it in this structure, you kind of get a better understanding of where people sit, okay? Yes, you can have an extremely communal society that is highly authoritarian, aka a communist dictatorship, okay? When the left is talking about socialism, they're not talking about a dictatorial socialism, they're talking about a democratic socialism. And as I said, relative to the world standard, even democratic socialism is still slightly right-leaning. I know that's something that a lot of people on both sides of the aisle are going to push back on, but it's true. And the reason is, even a democratic socialism such as Denmark or Norway is inherently capitalist. The more capitalist a system is, the more individual a system is. Because the idea is that you on an individual level should be seeking as much individual wealth, prosperity, and standard of living as you can. And the more capital you have, the more power you have to leverage that status to improve your class. Adding Medicare for all is not going to take us out of a capitalist system. Adding free college for all is not going to take us out of a capitalist system. Jeff Bezos is still going to be able to lobby the government for billions of dollars whether we happen to get Medicare for all or not. So even the systems that the current progressive wing of the party are pushing for are still leaning on the individual side rather than the communal side. Okay? America is actually pretty far right when it comes to that stuff. Extremely capitalistic, extremely individual. Now, as a reminder, when we say right, we're not saying right as in conservative. We are saying right as in an individualist society rather than a communal society. Okay? Now, authority versus liberty. Those are two completely apples and oranges things. You'll notice that a social libertarian is extremely communal but focused on liberty, whereas a communist dictatorship is not. Okay? If you were to develop a society that was ultimate maximum liberty that you could possibly have while also being ultimately focused on the individual, you would effectively have a hermitage. In other words, we would all live in shacks, isolated from each other, not cooperating in any kind of society or market at all, doing our own thing, probably hunting deer and growing crops. That is an ultimate liberty, ultimate individual society. Okay? An ultimate communal society that is also completely libertarian, lacking in authority, is effectively a tribalism. One of the biggest frustrations and gripes that I have when dealing with any kind of civics at all is the idea that you cannot have a society without authority. Okay? For a significant majority of the entirety of human existence, we have been a tribalism. Okay? Any authority that is granted in the tribe is granted based on meritocracy. It is the oldest, wisest ones who have the most valued experience that we turn to for leadership. But ultimately, in a tribalism, I don't own all the spears. Just because I went out and got the wood, And just because I sharpened the pointy tip of the stick doesn't make those sticks mine. The tribe has communal ownership of it, and when the tribe goes out and hunts, it's not my spear's the one that hit the boar's neck, therefore the meat is mine. You hunt as a group, okay? Tribalism has actually been the predominant form of government for a significant majority of human history, and the only reason why it stopped being that way is because the authoritarian societies also tend to be imperialistic. And it's no surprise that even though without the influence of external factors, I would argue that those tribalist societies, aka Native Americans, Aborigines, even the early history of the Mongolian Empire, they were originally nomadic before they began to settle down and begin engaging in architecture. They were largely tribalism, and they were a tribalist society up until you started seeing the Khans unite them. So, all throughout history, you can see evidence of tribal societies that have been prosperous and thrived and done very well. To this day, tribalist societies still exist in the Amazon. And there are stories of people going down, and, obviously we live in 2020. Even the people that are living in a very tribal way out in the Amazon, hunting and gathering, they still know about our society. They know we exist. I mean, there's nowhere where we haven't influenced the world. It's not like an American has never made it to the Amazon before, right? But the thing is that when we go and we speak to those tribal societies that still exist to this day, and we tell them about our society and how superior it is, and how you can walk into a grocery store and just get food and you don't have to, fight for your survival on a daily basis, their response is, America, isn't that the place where people jump off of the top of buildings and kill themselves because of how miserable they are? It's interesting that we as the first world look down on those kinds of countries and those kinds of societies, but the fact of the matter is that they haven't changed over all this time because they haven't had a need to. They don't care. They're doing all right. They're living in an equitable society where people are looking out for each other, they feel protected, they feel safe. And ultimately, that's the cornerstone of human nature, is our goal is survival. Okay? Because of that, on this scale, I lean heavily towards the communal side. A hermitage would have absolute individual freedom, yes. You can, if you could find a place in the world where some form of authority hasn't implemented a government over it, if you could go somewhere deep enough into the mountains where you could build a shed and live off of the fruit of the land and be an ultimate individualist, you can do that. Your survival will not be nearly as secured as somebody who is living in a tribal manner. And you can live in a tribal manner and still lack authority. You do not need government. Okay? Now, as we look at this, you'll notice that a fascism is far right. It is ultimate individualism. Okay? That is also something that causes a lot of conflict when people first hear that. It's something that they don't necessarily like to know that, far right is tied to fascism. But ultimately it is. It is inherently populist. It is deeply rooted in eugenics. And the entire point of fascism is the belief that certain people are inherently better than other people. And because of that, they have individual authority over others. And they are also extremely authoritarian. That manifests when brown shirts knock on the door and say, "Oh, you look awfully Jewish to me. I'm going to throw you in a camp, and I'm going to take your assets." Okay? So yes, a fascism is highly authoritarian, but it's also highly individual, which is on the opposite side of the individual communal scale than a communist dictatorship is. However, communist dictatorships are also extremely authoritarian. The biggest example that you could probably obviously think of is, the classical USSR and Stalin, right? Even though Stalin and Hitler were extremely authoritarian. One was very communal, the other was very fascist. And they were enemies in the war as a result of that. Obviously, this is not a history on World War II, but it is a little example of how you can see the difference of one authoritarian society over another authoritarian society, and how being communal versus individual would manifest differently. Okay? In a completely, truly communist society, there would be no class. And if there is no class, then there is no other. There is no, that group is responsible for everything that's wrong with our society, and that group should be punished for it. Sound familiar? That's because, guess what? Hate to say it, our modern day right wing of the party is very fascist, in both their ideology and in their attempted implementation of it. Okay? So, with that in mind, knowing that I believe that a libertarian socialism is the ideal, I want to bring up a man named Benjamin Tucker. Okay? Now, Benjamin Tucker here is a pretty interesting fellow. Obviously, we share a last name, and he kind of looks like me too. Makes me wonder. It really does. But Benjamin Tucker is effectively the founder of the Anarchy Party. Okay? He did not come up with the name anarchy. He believed that he was a social libertarian or a left libertarian. However, he was labeled as an anarchist, and rather than pushing back on it and really rebelling against the idea, he basically said, well, since anarchy is the absence of government, and a social libertarianism is, in effect, a society that is not governed, yeah, sure, call me an atheist. Like, he was cool with it. All right? But one thing that he was not cool with was some of the fallacies of what people would prescribe to socialism and communism, because he knew that there was more than one way to skin that cat. Okay? So, one of his buddies, Jim Stanford, said not all modern economists believe Marxists established a hegemony over definitions of socialism. In other words, Marx ain't the only guy that gets to decide what socialism is. Okay? You can be a socialist and not a Marxist. They are different things. The manifestation of Marxism is a lot more authoritarian. But capitalism is not the only economic system which relies on markets. That is obvious. Here we think we invented capitalism, and before that there was no trade. As if there wasn't a place where producers could sell excess supplies of agricultural goods, or, you could sell things that were in local abundance to you in places where they were scarce and exotic, right? I mean, markets have always existed before there was capitalism. And markets can continue to exist post-capitalism. So the idea that in order to fight against capitalism, you have to eliminate the market, I mean, that is effectively what a fully blown communism is. It is saying it does not matter what job you do, there is no merit to your labor, all people receive equal results, regardless of effort. That is the elimination of market. It is not about what you produce, it is about what you receive. Okay? But the thing is that markets weren't the problem with capitalism. Class was the problem with capitalism. And that is where libertarianism and socialism actually can intersect. Okay? Because libertarianism is the belief that nobody should have inherent authority over other people. We should all have the liberty to choose and decide for ourselves without somebody else telling us what to do. That is what classical libertarianism was. Now, the modern day Tea Party has definitely twisted that into a right-wing version of capitalism, where it becomes no authority should ever be exerted on a corporation, should be exerted on a market. That's also two different things, very much so. Okay? And the reason why those two things are so different is because when you're dealing with a system where when you're dealing with a system where you have an authority, right? That authority has control over your life, okay? It is a government. Now, a corporation is also a government, and that's where the distinction lies. That's where the difference is, okay? Is that the CEO of a corporation is effectively the governing authority body of that social group. And they are every bit as much a government as our American government is. They have dictatorial authority on how the company is run, what you do in that company, and what you are paid for in that company. And it is a very much capitalist system. All right? So what Benjamin Tucker wanted to do is he wanted to eliminate the class. So he said the fact that one class of men are dependent for their living upon the sale of their labor, while another class of men are relieved of the necessity of labor by being legally privileged to sell something that is not labor. What does that mean? What he's saying is that there are different classes of people in our society. There are the people who are paid for their labor, and there are the people who get to sell things that are not labor-based. In other words, I get to purchase your labor from you at a discounted price and then sell what you produce as a profit. I am not exerting labor. I am using capital to increase my wealth. Okay? And to such a state of things, I am as much opposed as anyone. But the minute you remove privilege, every man will be a laborer, exchanging with fellow laborers. What anarchistic socialism aims to abolish is usury. It wants to deprive capital of its reward. Effectively, what Benjamin Tucker wanted to do was he wanted to move away from a capital-based system and move into a labor-based system, where your work and your value was based on what you produced. And that's it. There is no, I'm going to pay you as little as possible and then pressure you to produce as much as possible so that I can gain wealth off of your labor. There is no such thing as a boss in this system. You do not get to own my labor. That's what he was going for, okay? And while I could not find the quote during my research for this video in particular, Benjamin Tucker did die around the 1940s. He did live a long life to about 85. And I know in his later years when he was in his 60s, he unfortunately had his ideals ultimately defeated. He ultimately said that he did not believe that his vision of a social libertarianism would be possible in his lifetime. And there's a very somber reason for why that is. And it kind of goes back to authority versus liberty, okay? The idea was that here in America, there is already an authority system in place. And that authority system will not give up power willingly. Therefore, the only way to change the system is via force. He actually had many, many talks about the right of might versus the right of contract. He was inherently against the belief that human beings had inalienable rights. Sounds terrible. However, his acknowledgement of that was a very wise one that I think we all need to acknowledge. We do not have an inherent God-given right to life. The classical libertarians of the French Revolution, like John Locke, he originally said life, liberty, and the pursuit of property. The more modern-day libertarians and socialists, libertarian socialists, have basically acknowledged that that is not an inalienable right. We do not have an inherent right to life. That is actually a right that is granted to us by the government. If there was no government, what gives us the right to live? If there is no authority, then there is nothing stopping something from killing us. We don't have an inherent right to prevent it. What Benjamin Tucker said is that we only have two inherent rights, and one grants the other. The only true right is the right of might. In other words, absent government, absent society, granted nothing but the laws of nature and nothing more, the only right that I have, the only thing I am entitled to, is the thing that I have the might to claim. It's kind of true. And when a society fools itself into thinking that it has more privileges that it is entitled to than it really does, is when that society is at risk of losing the privileges that it has gained beyond its inherent natural privileges. We don't have a right to freedom. We don't have a right to life. We don't have a right to liberty. We only have a right to might. And we don't have a lot of it. But who does have a lot of might is the government. And the government has used its might to grant us additional rights. Do not be fooled. The government can take those rights away. We don't have an inherent right to them. And a world can, and via the law of averages probably will exist sometime in the future where those rights are gone. Okay? The second right that Benjamin Tucker identified was the right of contract. Okay? Now, the right of contract is dependent upon the right of might. However, the reason why the right of contract kind of deserves its own category is because there is the old saying, a man's word is his bond, right? If you enter into a contract with another individual, in other words, an agreement, I do this in exchange for you doing that, well, there is absolutely nothing stopping either party from breaking that contract other than the might of the government coming down upon them if they break it. Independent of that, however, it does not change the fact that if they do break it, they have lost their right to contract. Because everybody knows that once a man does not follow his word, once an individual is shown to be dishonest, lacking in integrity, and lacking in honor and lacking in word, they will no longer enter into contract with that man. So, effectively, there is some degree of right of contract, even though that right can be overpowered by right of might. The fact of the matter is that you do have a right to be trusted in your word until you break that trust, and then you lose your right of contract. So the right of might and the right of contract are the only two rights that are inherent to man. Now, as we start moving into these concepts and we start looking at socialism versus capitalism and things of that nature, keep in mind that I am not simply talking about the government that we live under. I am talking about the broad organization of people, how we structure ourselves, how we live as a society. We are not a hermitage. And if you want to be one and you can find a place where you could, go for it. So, if we're going to live in a society, the society has to be structured in a certain way. And that society could be structured in a way that favors individuals, or it could be structured in a way that favors communities. If you were to look at the generic definition of socialism that is widely accepted by countries that identify themselves as socialist, not what we decide to define it as. We all know the textbook definition that we as Americans give about the means of production and all that bullshit, right? Well, if you ask a socialist what they define socialism as, they basically say it's when the right of property is in the control of the proletariat. In other words, it's when the people get to decide how resources are used. Kind of basic, but it fits pretty well. So, going back to that, if we look at a capitalist structure versus a monarchy, you will notice that not much has changed. A corporation is structured no differently than a monarch was. The only difference is, instead of being so hyper individual that there is a single entity at the top, you might have a board of directors. You might have a handful of people that act as an oligopoly rather than a simple monopoly. But at the top, whether you have an individual owner slash CEO or you have a board of directors, they are the ones with the authority. They are the ones that decide how the society is run. Again, don't think of a corporation as anything other than a society. And in that regards, we can look at it no differently than we look at a government, right? It has its own form of government. It has its CEO, it has its leader, it has its board of directors. Beneath that, it has its COO, its CFO, its regional directors. Then you start getting into the district managers and the area managers, and below that you have store level management and supervisors. Then you have the vendors and contractors, right? This all follows down the same structure as a king did. The king had his barons, the barons had their nobles, then there were freemen. Okay, the freemen still worked the land, they were still labor-based individuals, but they were at least free. People do not necessarily know these days that serfs originate from a Roman Latin word, and it basically meant slave. Okay? I'll say this right now. The serfs were obviously treated way better than many examples of slavery in human history, but at the end of the day, medieval serfs were slaves. Their rights were tied to the land. They were granted the ability to work the land and live on the land and eat off of the land. However, all of the land was owned by the king, or at the very least, the baron or the noble. And if a baron or a noble decided to sell the land, you effectively sold the serfs with the land. They were tied to it as an extension of the property. They were property. When one noble sold land to another, they were selling the serfs with it. They came included in that exchange, which, by the way, not that different from a tenancy agreement, right? If you have a lease on a property and somebody sells that property, your lease sells with the property. Very similar to how a serf would have been sold with the land, whereas a freeman lived independently of that. They were contracted to work the land, but they were ultimately free. They were not bought and sold together with the parcel. A very similar comparison to that is how a corporation treats a vendor or a contractor versus an hourly employee, right? The hourly employee is theirs. They own them. Their productivity is their profit, right? They pay them as little as possible, and in exchange for that, expect them to be as productive as possible. But when their productivity goes up, does their wages increase in proportion to that productivity? No. The productivity belongs to the CEO. What you produce is theirs, not yours. Now, if they need specialized work, like say when Christmas rolls around and Home Depot needs you to put up all of the displays, they might not rely on their hourly employees for that. They will contract it out to a vendor. Very similar to how freemen were effectively contractors that were used to work the land when they had a shortage of serfs. The structure is no different. Okay? Now, here's the problem. As we move in to a socialist democracy, okay, what happens is, let's look at an example about 20 years ago in Argentina, okay? Argentina was going through an economic crisis. In that economic crisis, many workplaces had failed. The capitalist who owned those workplaces effectively just left. And the workers, the laborers, were left to their own devices. And since they were left to their own devices, they basically created, as best they could, a democratic socialism. Okay? Now keep in mind, I'm not a democratic socialist. I am a social libertarian. There are differences, okay? And those differences are important. When you look at a democratic socialist, the idea was we democratically decide who gets equitable distribution of wealth, right? And that's what they tried to set up. Now, when they did that, effectively what they did was they chopped the head off the top of the pyramid, and they made it look like this. So with all of the bosses gone, with the capitalists out, and nothing but the laborers remaining, and a market that has failed, with those laborers left to their own devices to rebuild it, what they did was they established a workers' council. And rather than only the top 1%, 3% in a capitalism that are the elite, the authoritarians in the society, they made it to where it was closer to 20%. Now, the Workers' Council, what they ended up doing is they became largely responsible for conveying information and making decisions. Whereas the laborers, even though they had access to that council, even though they had the ability to vote, just like everybody else, they didn't. Why? Because they're laborers. So what the laborers did was they focused on their work. They are busy breaking their backs doing the hard thing. The Workers' Council effectively ended up being the people that were more the decision makers. The closest example that I can give in American society to what happened in Argentina is basically like an HOA board. If anybody's ever been part of a homeowners association, you know what happens there, right? The people that have the biggest agenda, the people who want the most influence and the most authority, or just the people who were the most bored and had the most time to complain, are the ones who show up to the HOA meetings and vote on stuff, right? And 80% of the HOA doesn't show up to the meetings. So that 20% ends up being the 20% that decides whether or not your HOA dues go up. They're the ones that decide whether or not you should be paying for this landscaping project over here, or whether you should be installing cameras next to the carports, right? 80% of the population might not give two shits about whether or not there's a camera on the carport, but that 20% sure does want it done. So effectively what happens, tying back to the socialist democracy that was formed, is that even though everybody did have a vote, only 20% of the society did. And the 20% of the society that did were the ones that were basically in jobs that were not labor-based, but were rather what I would like to call the coordinator class, okay? They were the ones that were responsible for organizing and coordinating things, doing the logistics of the business, rather than the labor of the business. So what happened was, even though they made a socialist democracy, the class system was not abolished. At first they did everything right. They made the wages fair. They made a more equitable society where the bottom was getting a fair amount of pay. But over the course of those 20 years, as time went on, the old structures ended up falling back into place. You know, it's kind of funny. Even though I am very much agnostic now, it reminds me of an old quote that I learned from the LDS Church when I was growing up. They were talking about Catholics versus Protestants. And one of the analogies that they always used was the idea behind making a shirt. So if you take a shirt that is flawed, and that shirt, for whatever reason, was not designed right, Either the collar's too tight, the waist's too big, the sleeves are crooked, whatever. You take that messed up shirt and you try to fix it, right? Now you can take that shirt and using that flawed copy, try to redesign a new copy. But the more you make a copy of a copy of a copy of the shirt, it's not going to improve the flaws, right? What you have to do is you have to go back to the original design and fix it from the original inception of the shirt. Now, ironically, that was meant to kind of attack the rest of Christianity, to say that, well, Protestants are just reformists. If the religion that they're reforming was wrong, you're not going to come up with something that's right. Now, I heard that and I said, great logic, I'm agnostic, because y'all ain't right either. But tying back to the way this played out, just because they tried to create a socialist democracy does not mean that they were not operating on the same broken framework of capitalism. So effectively what they were doing was they were trying to take a flawed shirt and redesign it into a perfect shirt. The same thing, and it didn't work. And the reason why it didn't work was effectively because of the class system. What ended up happening is the laborers ended up falling into a lower class. And it inherently happens that way because the laborers are too busy laboring to pay too close of attention of what decisions are being made, what regulations are being put in place, what laws are being passed, and so on. Whereas the coordinator class, who are not inherently labor-based, they're more of a service-based group. They were the ones that ended up being the ones that were the most participatory in the workers' council. And they ended up effectively becoming the upper class. And then all of a sudden, rather than having, the 1% elite, which controlled and made decisions for the masses, they had the 20% elite. Is it a better system than, the one that we have now? I would still argue yes. Like, even if it is not the perfect ideal system, it's still better than we got, and we shouldn't let perfect be the enemy of the good. So, in our limited capacity to make the changes that we can right now, we should still be moving towards that more equitable society. The problem is that when we come back to Benjamin Tucker, where his view of a truly social libertarian society ended up falling apart, was the belief that there's still a power structure in place. And even this does not solve the power structure. All it does is cut off the top of the pyramid, but then the next rung becomes the elite. So yeah, you've opened the door for more people to reach that authoritative level. But by no means have you bucked the class system in any real way. Now, if we break the macro down into a micro and look at a smaller example, just think about any business. Again, we're looking at businesses as societal structures, right? If you work at a restaurant and one day we came in and we got rid of the restaurant manager and we said, okay, guys, proceed. The rest of the restaurant structure still exists. You still have your busboys, you still have your waiters and waitresses, you still have your cooks, and then you have your executive chefs and your sous chefs, you still have the greeter, you still have all those other jobs, right? If you take the restaurant manager out, what do you have left? Well, you still have a customer base that wants food. You still have a service that you're providing to produce the food, and you still have a community of people who are trying to fulfill that need in exchange for their continued prosperity and survival. And the fun part is that what ends up happening is the chef comes in and goes, well, I am the most skilled laborer here. I went to culinary school. I know how to garnish a plate. I know what people are going to want to eat. I know what tastes good and what doesn't taste good. I'm the person who can contribute the most to the prosperity of our organization. So listen to me. I will decide what's on the menu. I will decide how much things should cost, and I will decide how much money you guys all make. And we all know that the busboy's a little bitch, and he's not worth anything. His labor is completely lacking in skill. He needs no social skills to talk to customers. He doesn't need to know how to cook. He doesn't need to know how to do anything other than spray water at a dish. So the dishwashers and the busboys end up being the lower class in that system. They are still at the bottom of the barrel just because you got rid of the manager. It doesn't change the fact that the waiters and the cooks are still going to look down on them. It still doesn't change the fact that when the cook dirties a bunch of dishes, they're going to throw it at the dishwasher and say, "Have at it, peasant," right? The class system still exists. You got rid of the boss, but good for you. Now everybody looks to the chef as the leader. So by the end of those 20 years, the Workers' Council felt defeated. They were like, we did everything right. We had this magical system, not magical, we had this perfect storm, this perfect petri dish, where Benjamin Tucker said that the reason why an equitable society could never exist is because authority will never give it up. Now, the part that I missed, the other side of that coin, is that if authority will never give it up, then the only way that you can take it from them is by your right of force, right? Because those are the only two real rights we have. So if somebody has authority and will not leave their authority behind, the only way to wrestle that authority away from them is by exercising your right of might. Which, if you have enough might, you have enough power, you have enough men, you have enough guns, you have enough meat shields, you have enough blood to spill to take the authority away from that person, then what's left is you with authority. And now we have to trust that you, with enough might and enough authority to overthrow this government, is now simply going to give up your authority and allow a tribalist society where there are no bosses, are no leaders to exist. The Argentinians had the perfect scenario, the perfect storm, where the authority just left. They kind of just gave up on the country and walked away. And yet, because the model of the shirt was still based on the original flawed design of capitalism, the authority structure fell back in place even though they tried to get rid of it. Which leads to a final conclusion on that subject, which is that as long as there is a division of labor, there will be a division of class. Just simply becoming a more social society versus a more individual society may become more equitable as a whole, but the only way you're ever going to achieve true equity, true balance in a society, is to eliminate the class completely. And you cannot do that unless you redesign the entire concept of what a job in a society is supposed to be. And that is the part that Benjamin Tucker never seemed to be able to figure out. He always used to think that if you just simply got rid of the executive class, got rid of those decision makers, then everybody would just simply be laborers and we would trade back and forth based on our labor. But the problem is that not all labor is equal, right? Even when you're in that restaurant, people are going to hold the cook in higher esteem than the dishwasher because the cook knows how to make the food and the dishwasher only knows how to clean it. So, what's the solution? The solution is to restructure labor to be completely classless. But there's a cost to that. The cost is the sacrifice of skilled labor. Okay? The idea is that instead of having a hierarchical system where you have your pyramid at the top and you disseminate your authority downward, we move to a classless system where nobody has individualized jobs. So instead of there being 30 different employees in that restaurant, one's washing the dishes, one's bussing the tables, one's greeting the customers, the other one's waiting on them, and then you've got the cooks and all of that. Instead, just simply restructure it. So if you work at that restaurant, everybody does everything. Everybody talks to the customers. Everybody cleans the dishes. Everybody cooks the food. Now, I may be a better cook than the rest of you, but that doesn't mean I'm the only one that gets to cook. Everybody cooks. Everybody greets. Everybody waits. Everybody performs all of the tasks that go into that enterprise in equal portions, with a caveat, okay? And this is my caveat. Human beings are human beings. We still have a right to negotiate. We still have a right to barter, okay? I'll tell you this right now. I love washing the dishes. I would happily spend more time washing the dishes and less time cooking the food. But that's my elective choice within the society that I'm in. So the idea is that in a cooperative, there's no owner. If you work at the restaurant, you own the restaurant. Whatever profits the labor of that restaurant produces, you all have equal right to. Now, the libertarian part is that you within that cooperative do have the freedom to decide upon your rules. How does that manifest? Well, to me, guess what? I am not a particularly materialistic person. Once I've had enough to sustain me, I don't need constantly fancier cars and nicer things. In my personal opinion, I would rather work less for a modest living than work more so that I can have a little bit more than everybody else. So if I were to be in a cooperative of my 10, 20 people that formed whatever cooperative business we wanted to, I might make the argument that I don't want to work 60 hours a week, guys. I'm okay with working 20 hours instead of 40 and getting half the shares of profits of the rest of you. And in an equitable society, that is okay. If you want the nicer car, if you want a little bit bigger piece of the pie, if you want to be a little bit more prosperous than everybody else, then put in a little bit more labor and you'll get it. If you want to work 50 hours instead of 40, then we'll give you 5/4 of the profit compared to everybody else. Also on an individual level, guess what? If everybody hates to do the dishes but me, and I'm the one guy that likes it, and I'm the only one that wants to, is it okay within a free cooperative unit for me to say, I'm going to do a little bit more of that in lieu of doing a little bit less of this? Sure. But the point is that it's voluntary, right? There is no class involved. It is not Sean washes the dishes because he is of a lower class and less skilled than the rest of us. It's Sean washes the dishes because he chooses to, and he has the freedom to do whatever the hell he wants just like everybody else, okay? There is, however, two things that have to exist in a cooperative for the cooperative to exist at all, which is a system in place for how you join it and a system in place for how you leave it. In my mind, when you join a cooperative, you own the cooperative, which means that you equally participate in the labor. We live in a system where the labor has been decentralized and destructured. So instead of individuals doing individual tasks, you have a collective group performing collective tasks. And if everybody hates cleaning the bathroom, then you have to spend equal time cleaning the bathroom. We're not going to make a bathroom bitch and consider him a lower class, right? With that said, if somebody wants to do the bathroom more than somebody else, and they on a one-to-one level within the cooperative agree that they take their bathroom shift and instead, in exchange for them taking their cooking shift, fine. As long as it's an equitable society, it's okay. We're down with that. All right? Now, from there, the question is, how does that society exist in the larger framework, okay? The beautiful thing about that society is that I believe that that society can exist within our current country as it exists today. I see no reason Even though it hasn't necessarily been done before, I see no reason why it couldn't. We have no law in place. We have nothing whatsoever stopping people from doing that. If me and 5 other people got together and decided that we were going to equally buy a business, and from then on, whenever that business expanded, anybody that we join is granted equal ownership of that business, and then from there just simply pay them based on their labor. The more labor you put out, or perhaps the more productive you are. Either of those things are options. We've been using a restaurant analogy so far. It doesn't have to be. It could be a production-based restaurant, or a production-based business. Maybe it's simply a business where we chop down trees, take the wood, and whittle them into widgets. Okay? Well, in a society like that, instead of just saying, I want to work 20 hours instead of 40, so I'm willing to take half the shares, maybe you instead say, guess what? I can make 150 widgets per hour and you can only make 100. So I'm going to get the share of the profit of our company based on my production. If you have a service-based company, you might move towards the time investment. How many hours are you spending? Okay? However, on the flip side of that, if you worked in a production based, if you were an assembly line worker at a factory producing a good, you might look at it as a production based value, where you say you can make 50% more widgets per hour than I can. So you make the profit based on the number of widgets you can produce. The moral of the story is that we're deciding this as a group. Okay? We are a cooperative. There is no leader telling everybody else how things should be. We negotiate. We make decisions collectively, and once we've settled on something, we put that in place as our rules. That's how our little cooperative runs. Does my cooperative have to do just one thing? No. My cooperative likes to farm. My cooperative likes to produce. And we like to do different things with those productions. You can expand your industry in different ways. You can make a more... Just as we are dividing up labor so that, or rather undividing labor, we can also, and moving away from specialized labor, we could also move away from specialized businesses. There is no reason why a cooperative couldn't do a variety of different things. The point is that there is no authority above you telling you what to do. The cooperative is deciding as a collective. And then from there, you do still, of course, have your society at large. So the way I see it is, when you exist inside of a cooperative structure like that, where there is no pyramid anymore, it's just a group of people collectively doing all of the tasks necessary to produce whatever it is that they're producing. And keep in mind, not all cooperatives, we've been talking so far about a cooperative being inherently capitalistic, right? Where they're selling a good, they're selling a service. Even that doesn't necessarily have to be true. You could have a cooperative that doesn't particularly engage in the market. You might have a cooperative where they set up food, they set up shelter, they've got housing for everybody, and they're good. If they produce a surplus, they sell the surplus, and then they're more profitable. If they don't, then they stop and they enjoy. They live like a tribe. They live like tribes always have. They get enough food to eat, their shelter's taken care of, and they spend the rest of the time telling stories over a campfire. It doesn't matter. The point is, as a cooperative, you're deciding that. The authority is gone. Okay? So, what need do you have for a government? The cooperative can decide the laws. The cooperative can decide what happens when you steal, what the punishment is, what happens when you kill, what the punishment is. The cooperatives can decide the laws amongst themselves. Okay? And there are 2 golden rules to every cooperative that tie back to the libertarian part, which is that every cooperative has a right to refuse a member. In other words, if I have a cooperative with 25 members in it, and some guy wants to come into the cooperative, and we look at him and we say, we don't like that guy. He's lazy, he sucks, we don't want the cut of his jib. He can't join our cooperative. That person has the freedom to go find another one. Okay? Once you're in the cooperative, the entire cooperative is effectively operating by right of contract. It is a group of people agreeing to organize themselves in a certain way and to cooperate with each other in order to increase each other's security and prosperity. That's all a cooperative is. Okay? Once you're in that cooperative, if we find out that Johnny has been stealing from us, and we have laws in place on what we decide happens when Johnny steals, and we go to Johnny and we say, Johnny, time for you to pay the fine. We caught you stealing. This is the repercussion that we as a cooperative decided. And Johnny says no. Well, there is one final authority that all cooperatives have, which is the right of exile. In other words, the individual in a cooperative has the right to join, has the right to leave. The collective group has the right to exile. In other words, you ain't following our rules, you're breaking them, and you're refusing to abide by the punishments of the rules that you break. You're not working in our society. You're out. Okay? An individual that is not part of a cooperative is inherently a contractor. In other words, he is an individual. He is not part of a community. He is not part of a group. So he's either in a hermitage, as we saw earlier, out doing his own thing in the boonies, and maybe every once in a while he comes down with his pelts to sell to the different cooperatives. Or maybe he isn't quite a hermitage. Maybe he lives in the society at large but is still independent. That's the beauty about this system, okay? Is that it has room for both the individual, if they're crazy enough to want to be one. To me, it's contrary to human nature and human survival. But guess what? I'm as libertarian as it gets. I'm as libertarian to the point where I'm okay with you going off on your own and dying in the woods if you don't want to be part of our society. Have at it, hoss. Okay? But any interaction that you do with us is by right of contract, because you aren't part of our society. So if you come down from your shack up in the woods where you're a professional fur trapper and you want to sell your goods to us, that's a contract. You're agreeing to exchange goods for currency. Even currency could exist on a cooperative level and could be labor-based. You don't need a government-wide currency, right? Currency is a social, it's a market lubricant, okay? Society has existed without currencies for a very long time, and we just bartered, okay? As far as currency is concerned, I don't care. If a cooperative wants to make a currency that's labor-based, where every hour you work, you get one certificate of labor, and then have an internal market within that cooperative where you can buy and exchange goods using that currency, go for it. And if you're outside of that cooperative, but you trade with them regularly, so you have enough value of exchanging those certificates with them, and you're okay with using their currency, go for it. If you as a larger society wanted to get together and have a nationally recognized currency, you could do that. And if an individual cooperative didn't want to recognize the currency, they could do that. Okay? The point is that whatever government exists would effectively be a consortium. I see 3 different ways that you would interact with that consortium, okay? The consortium is effectively the equivalent of either the division of labor or a traditional government, okay? But what the consortium does is either A, a co-op can elect a representative. Personally, I think that's the smartest move. Because keep in mind, we're not talking about a representative democracy like the one we have right now. Because the one we have right now is bullshit. Okay? And the one we have right now, some dude sells you a bill of goods and then he gets to do whatever he wants for 4 years. And then you either let them continue or you fire them and replace them with somebody else. But at the end of the day, you are basically saying, yep, I choose you to have authority over me. That's not what we're doing here. In this one, if your individual co-op has 32 people in it and you identify a representative in the consortium, then basically that person is going to vote on behalf of your 32 people. And since the cooperative is both localized and communal, it's not the same. You're not voting for some stranger on television. You're voting for Johnny. And we all know that Johnny's smart. We all know that Johnny's shrewd. We all know that Johnny's the smoothest talker. But at the end of the day, the rising tide lifts all ships. Okay? So if the cooperative is successful, Johnny's successful. And if the cooperative is not successful, Johnny's not successful. So since we know Johnny is the most talented guy at politicking, Johnny's the guy that's going to go to the consortium and represent us. But here's the thing. Not all cooperatives are going to be as, like, totally cool and, you know, like, down with the community as mine is, right? Some cooperatives might be a little bit more individualist, where they still want, even though they're a cooperative, they still want more of that individual authority, right? And in that scenario, maybe rather than having a representative, they just don't. They all equally vote, okay? Now, the contractors, since contractors are not part of a cooperative and they are inherently individual, they inherently get individual votes, okay? The consortium is basically the congregation of everybody who votes. Ideally, it'll be as representative based as possible so that it is as small as possible. But it's not going to be representative in the same way that the Senate is. The Senate is inherently non-democratic, and the reason why it is because it doesn't matter if California has 100 times the population as Rhode Island, they all get 2 senators, which means effectively Rhode Island, the citizens of Rhode Island have more authority to decide the laws of our government than California does. It's a relic of the past that does not make sense and does not work in our modern day society. Obviously, social democrats know that, right? But the social democrats just don't do a good enough job of getting rid of the class system, all right? So in a consortium, they're only going to have 2 functions and 2 functions alone: societal services and judicial disputes between co-ops. They do not need to write sweeping laws of the entire land. The co-ops do that. They decide the laws against their own people. The problem with that is what happens when 2 different co-ops butt heads, right? What if there was a trade agreement between 2 different co-ops and that created a dispute? Or what if one guy from one co-op robbed somebody from another co-op and the co-op that has the offender in it is unwilling to, you know, give that person to the mercy of the other one's justice? What do you do then? Okay? So in that sense, the consortium will act as a judicial branch. But they're not necessarily, you know, interpreting existing laws that an authoritative government has implemented. Instead, what they're doing is they're saying, what are the rules of this cooperative? What are the rules of that cooperative? Where did things go wrong? And what is the just solution? Okay? And if you reach a catastrophic point where one cooperative is unwilling to adhere to the rules of the consortium, we're falling back to the right of might. And as much as people continue to probably see the right of might as this horrible thing as we're supposed to move away from, the fact of the matter is that we always have to acknowledge the realities of it. Okay? And the entire purpose of the consortium is to negate the need for the right of might as much as humanly possible. That's it. Okay? From there, if you have a cooperative that is so upset and so aggrieved with the decision that the consortium came to that they refuse to adhere to its decision and they want to take up arms and they want to fight, if you think that that is a reason that a society like this does not work, you're retarded. Okay? Because guess what? Countries have been warring each other since the beginning of time. And the reasons why they war each other are either A, the desire for another's resources, or B, because they've been wronged in some way, or they have some kind of, you know, social bias or cultural bias against the other, whatever it may be. The point is, countries fight and countries war. Okay? So if you have a consortium where everybody is all in collective agreement, where they're sending either representatives or not, where they're just individually voting on how things go. And keep in mind, one of the biggest points of the consortium is the ability to abstain, right? one of the biggest issues with how a consortium might function is the idea of, well, the whole reason why we have a government is so that you don't have a full-time job sussing out whatever political issues of the day are. Like, we have politicians, so we don't have to deal with that shit. Well, guess what? That's why you have a representative in a co-op, so that you don't have to. And if y'all ain't with each other enough that you're okay selecting a representative and you all want to take that authority individually, go for it. But even if you're an unrepresented co-op and you've got 60 people in them and only 10 of them give a shit, then the other 50 just don't participate. They don't have to vote. Maybe those 10 couldn't decide on which one should be the representative, but those 10 really want to do it, so they all go do it together, and the other 50 don't care, so they don't bother. Or you could even have a partially represented co-op. I know I didn't have a spot for that in my graph, but there's nothing stopping you from saying, oh, those 50 people that don't care, they're okay with Timmy, but the other 9, like, they're just making a big stink about it. So we decided all 9 of them can be representatives, and, 10 of them are represented by that guy. You can divvy it up, whatever. It doesn't matter. The point is that the consortium is basically the participatory individual in the government. And again, their main function is just to simply solve disputes between cooperatives or societal services. Now, where the societal services come into play is basically infrastructure. It begins there and ends there. You don't need much outside of infrastructure. In a system like this, you really wouldn't need socialized healthcare. You also wouldn't need, the idea is that with a lot of those things, that it would be provided by the cooperative. And the big reason why I'm a big advocate of that is that if you look at all of the different societies that have implemented different forms of communism or socialism in the past, as a general rule of thumb, when it comes to the acceptance of the citizens of that society, generally the smaller and more homogenous a society is, the more communal it's willing to be. To really break that down into a simple explanation, Alabama don't give a shit about California. They're too different culturally, they're too different philosophically. Whereas, if we had statewide socialism on a state-by-state level, I do think that as a society, we'd probably be more accepting of a state-level Medicare for all than a national one, because the issue arises where people feel like their resources are going to people they don't know. We are more willing to support and protect our neighbors than we are strangers. It's unfortunate, but it's human nature. If I don't know you, I don't give a shit about you. Now, there are those who might be a little bit more intuitive and a little bit more big picture, and some of us that are more individualistic and not, so I'm not saying that there's not such thing as people who have compassion and sympathy and empathy for those that are far away and far removed from them. Of course we have compassionate people. I'm talking macro, I'm talking the whole society, right? And in general, on a macro level, an entire society will be more accepting of a socialist system if that society is smaller and more homogenous. Because the more of the people you know, the more you're willing to support them on average. Other people can still have enough compassion to recognize the need to help a stranger, to help somebody they've never met. They exist, but they exist in smaller numbers than people who are willing to help out a neighbor, somebody they know personally, right? So that's basically how everything works in a nutshell. And I do think that it is a solution to the right of might, because the beauty of it is that since the cooperative is existing on a smaller scale, on a local level, I believe that we can create cooperatives in our current system that exists right now. And I believe wholeheartedly that if we did create a cooperative where... look at Walmart, okay? If you were to take the annual profits of Walmart, and the last time I did these numbers was even like a year or two ago. I'm sure it's even worse now. If you were to take the profits of Walmart, and keep in mind that when a company measures profits, that includes expenses, right? profits equal income minus expenses. So after they've paid their laborers, after they've paid their employees, after they've paid for the building, the electricity, after they've sent their bribes / lobbyists to the government to, corrupt the government against the people in favor of Walmart, once they've spent all that money, then they have the profit. If you take just that and you divide it by the quantity, the number of employees that are employed by Walmart, guess what the profit is per employee? The average Walmart worker makes what? $10 an hour? $12 an hour? You know what that is per year? It's about $20,000. You can't live on it. But if you took the profit of Walmart and divide it by the number of employees, it's about $70,000 per person. And if you ask the capitalist why the bagger gets minimum wage when the company as a whole makes an average of $70,000 in profit per employee, the answer is, well, because he's not a skilled laborer. Because he has a shitty job. If he wants a better job, he should get a better education. He should strive to be the manager. He should strive to be the executive class. He should strive to be a decision maker and not a laborer. You see how our system is inherently an enemy to labor? You see how our system is inherently designed to extract the profits of labor and then put it in the hands of the executive? Do you understand that the system is inherently not equitable? And do you also understand that there's nothing stopping it from being that way, even with our government in place? All you have to do is make a company where the CEO doesn't exist. That's it. That's your equitable society. We all cook. We all clean. We all make equal share of the profits. And guess what? If you even wanted to have an executive class in the co-op, you could. But the point is, true socialism is where the proletariat has control of the means of production. In other words, the laborers have to own their labor. And the only way to do that is to own the entity that you operate in. It's the only way it can be done. So, I do have a few other ideas for videos that I'm going to be doing. Believe it or not, after all of this talk about anti-capitalism, I do actually come from a sales and a management background. I have actually interviewed more people than I have been interviewed myself by probably about 100 to 1. I know how to write a resume. I also know how to run my own business. I was in real estate for 4 years, and in those 4 years, I know how to do a CMA. I have a firm understanding of economics. I also have a firm understanding of how to maximize your pay, how to negotiate in an interview, how to get an interview, how to write a resume. I know how to exist within this capitalist society as much as I do not like it. So, in the future, if you guys would like to see some videos that are more related towards how to survive in this shitty system, I can help you with that. And also, if you guys would like to see some more content on how to create a more socialist libertarian society where we can all have a more equitable share of our worth, I would love to do that too. So let me know in the comments what kind of videos you guys would like to see in the future. I would love to hear your guys' feedback, any criticism, any advice on the system, or anything that I could have explained better, or maybe something that I made a mistake on. There were a couple times when I brain farted, I'm not gonna lie. I do this shit one take. So I rely on my knowledge and I rely on my eloquence, and if I mess up, I mess up. There's probably 2 or 3 ideas that I intended to put in this video that just never made it out of my brain, alright? So any content you guys are interested in, reach out, let me know. Please like, please follow. I really want to build a much wider audience, and I would love to get to a point where I can actually start interacting with you guys on an individual level and bringing you into the videos, helping you guys produce this content with me, right? I'm all part of that socialist society, right? So thank you for watching, and as always, I hope you guys have a fantastic day, and, you know, fight the